Hello. We are on chapter 15, which is the last chapter in the textbook. It covers psychotherapy, and the textbook defines psychotherapy as an interaction between a person and a mental health professional in which the focus is on understanding and changing the person's behaviors, thinking, and emotions. And in this video, I will talk about psychoanalysis and a few forms of behavior therapy. Let's go ahead and get started with psychoanalysis. It was developed by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud will sound very familiar to you because we have discussed his theory of personality in a couple of previous chapters. And the key term that we have associated with Sigmund Freud is the unconscious. The unconscious mind being everything we are unaware of. That would be our inner conflicts, emotions, desires, and urges, etc. So Sigmund Freud believed that a lot of our problems are due to our repressing the inner conflicts, emotions, and desires in the unconscious mind. And the purpose of therapy, psychoanalysis as he called it, was to help people gain insight into what is happening in the unconscious mind. And one of the main techniques that he used to help people gain insight into the unconscious mind is called free association. Free association is basically the therapist inviting the client to say anything that comes to mind, uncensored. A couple of other important keywords are resistance and transference. So these terms you want to be familiar with for the exam. Resistance basically refers to this idea that a client may not want to talk about something that is emotionally threatening. So for example, the client walks in and the therapist says, "Why don't you make yourself comfortable and just say anything that comes to mind?" And the client says, "How is that going to help us? That doesn't make any sense. Why would I do that?" And the therapist may look at that reaction as a form of resistance. The client is uncomfortable, doesn't want to really move towards the unpleasant feelings or inner conflicts that may be inside. And the therapist works with the resistance, helps the client understand it, gain insight into it, and kind of works with it as part of the treatment process. The last term I want you to be familiar with for the exam is called transference. Transference basically refers to this idea that some of the client's feelings and attitudes toward the therapist originated with some primary attachment figure. So let's say, again, let's work with an example. Let's say the therapist shows up 10 minutes late for session. And as the therapist is walking in, the client says, "You are 10 minutes late. I can't believe it." And the anger is again something that the therapist would want to explore and see maybe it is related to an experience or a set of experiences that the client had growing up. And it may be that through the process of exploration, it is discovered that when the client was growing up, her mom or dad or grandparent were often showing up late to pick her up from school. And that made her feel angry and abandoned. And some of these feelings that she used to feel with these primary attachment figures, she's now experiencing with her therapist as he or she is walking into the therapy late. Okay, we're going to leave psychoanalysis behind and move on to a very different kind of psychotherapy that is called behavior therapy. The good news about behavior therapy for you is that we have discussed a lot of the concepts that we will review again in the chapter on learning. And the two key concepts are operant and classical conditioning. So behavior therapy uses the principles of operant conditioning. Does it ring a bell? Rewards and punishment. It's about behavior and consequences, and the consequences having an effect on the behavior, and then classical conditioning, which would be association between two stimuli, stimulus learning. Let's start with the operant conditioning. So as I mentioned, operant conditioning basically is based on the principles of rewards and punishment. More often we use rewards, they tend to be a lot more effective. One technique that is often used with children is called behavioral modification. And behavior modification is a technique that basically allows teachers or counselors or parents to encourage children to develop new habits or behaviors. So let's work with a specific example. Let's say that there is a child in the classroom who is very disruptive, who engages who doesn't sit quietly, who disrupts the classroom activities, who speaks out of turn, etc. So a teacher may develop a behavioral modification plan where the teacher clearly outlines the behaviors that are expected of the child. In this case, it's sit quietly, then look at the teacher, listen, then think, and then talk. And the child is presented with this plan, and it is explained to him, and the child is told that if you can do these in a sequence successfully, each time you do these successfully, you will earn a token. And then when you earn 5 tokens, you can go and exchange the 5 tokens for a toy of your choice. And so the key here is the rewards, right? There are some kind of consequences through which we are encouraging the child to engage in these new target behaviors. All right, let's move on and talk about classical conditioning. The 2 classical conditioning therapy techniques that I'd like to discuss are exposure and systematic desensitization. Let's start with exposure. Exposure and systematic desensitization are actually both used in the treatment of anxiety disorders such as phobias. And exposure specifically is basically about exposing the person to the feared stimulus. So let's imagine that I have a phobia of alligators. And when I go to the Everglades, I am very, very terrified, and I don't want to actually step on the boardwalk because I'm so afraid of the alligators there. Well, an exposure therapy would be basically the kind of therapy where I am strongly encouraged to go down the boardwalk as close to the alligators as I possibly can and expose myself to that situation. And the idea here is that as I'm exposing myself through the process of habituation, I am less and less scared, and eventually I no longer feel that kind of phobic, intense reaction. Now, exposure is not always convenient. Sometimes it is very anxiety-provoking. And so another technique that is often used in treating specific phobias or other types of anxiety disorders is called systematic desensitization. So we're still on behavior therapy. We're talking about techniques, therapeutic techniques that use the principles of classical conditioning, and we're discussing systematic desensitization. So let's see what systematic desensitization is about. It basically has 2 components. The first component is some kind of a relaxation technique that basically allows the person to enter a state of autonomic nervous system activity that's parasympathetic, the kind of parasympathetic relaxed state. And when the person is in that state, that person is gradually exposed to the previously anxiety-provoking stimulus. So that let's work with an example of a spider this time. So if a client, let's say I have a phobia of spiders, I work with a therapist who is using systematic desensitization. So the first component is to get me in a state of relaxation. And the next step is that when I'm relaxed, the therapist will gradually expose me to increasingly anxiety-provoking versions of the stimulus with the spider. And it could be that the first time I'm relaxed, the therapist says, I want you to imagine there's a tiny little spider outside on a tree. So I imagine that. The next time I'm relaxed, the therapist may say, I want you to imagine there is a tiny little spider climbing on your hand. And the next time the therapist may say, I want you to imagine there's a big spider sitting on the table in front of you. And then the therapist may bring a spider, which is a Halloween decoration, get me into a relaxed state, and then put this spider right in front of me and encourage me to continue breathing and continuing with my relaxation. And eventually the last step would be to expose me to a real life spider that is very close to me. And so the idea here is that I am building a new set of associations with the previously feared stimulus. So instead of seeing a spider and being automatically scared, I'm first actually in a state of parasympathetic nervous system activity and then experiencing the spider, the stimulus that I used to be scared of in that state. And through this process, I'm building a new set of associations. These associations are between the spider and a relaxed state. And the relaxed state is the opposite of the anxiety state that I feel in my phobic state, which is the sympathetic nervous system activity. Okay, this basically wraps it up. I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention.